Welcome to the Midwinter Ball. I'm so glad you could all make it tonight.
Thank you, Your Grace. The ballroom is stunning.
300 witnesses. That is how many of England's most powerful people stood frozen in a gilded royal ballroom and watched a young woman in a servant's apron bring the 7th Duke of Ravenswood to his knees. They thought she had nothing left. They were wrong. London, March 1891. Outside Buckingham Palace, the city hummed with the restless energy of a kingdom at the height of its power. Gas lamps flickered along the Mall. Carriages clattered across wet cobblestones. The empire stretched across half the globe, and tonight, its finest gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to celebrate it. But inside the grand ballroom, behind walls draped in crimson silk and gold, something was about to happen that no guest, no lord, and no general would ever forget. At the center of it all stood Edmund Carlisle, the 7th Duke of Ravenswood, tall, dark-haired, impeccably tailored in a midnight blue coat with gold military trim that he had never earned on a battlefield. His jaw was sharp, his eyes were sharper, and his smile, the smile he deployed like a weapon at every gathering of consequence, was working the room with practiced, effortless precision. Dukes like Edmund were not born, they were constructed. 3 generations of the Carlisle name had been polished to a blinding shine, and Edmund wore that shine like armor. Every lord deferred to him, every lady angled for his attention. Even Queen Adelaide, seated on her throne dais at the far end of the ballroom, acknowledged him with a faint nod of recognition as he entered. Edmund Carlisle was, by every measure society possessed, untouchable. He had spent 30 years making absolutely certain of it. What the ballroom did not know, what no ballroom ever knew, was the price of that untouchability. 30 years earlier, in the cramped offices of a Southwark legal firm, an innocent man named Thomas Hewitt had been destroyed. A brilliant solicitor, an honest one, a man whose only crime was discovering something the Carlisle family needed buried. The charges against him were forged. The seal on the documents was not his. The prison that took his health and eventually his life was built on a lie. And the lie had a name. It wore a midnight blue coat. And tonight, I was smiling. No one noticed the maid moving along the eastern wall of the ballroom. That was, of course, precisely the point. Clara Hewitt, dark chestnut hair pinned beneath a lace headband, brown eyes that moved across a room the way a cartographer studies new terrain, quietly, completely, missing nothing. She wore the standard black dress and white apron of the Ravenswood household staff, and she had worn it, without complaint, for 2 years. 2 years of ironing Edmund Carlisle's shirts. 2 years of polishing the silver his family had purchased with her father's ruin. 2 years of waiting for a room powerful enough, a witness formidable enough, and a moment undeniable enough. Beneath her apron, pressed flat against her ribs, was a worn leather document case. Tonight was the night. "You are distracted this evening, Clara," murmured Mrs. Hartley, the Ravenswood head housekeeper, appearing at her elbow with the rigid posture of a woman who treated ballroom service like a military campaign. "I am perfectly focused, Mrs. Hartley," Clara replied, lifting a fresh tray of champagne flutes without breaking her stride. "His Grace is watching the staff closely tonight," the older woman warned, her voice dropping. "The Queen is present. One mistake, and I cannot protect you." Clara looked across the ballroom at Edmund Carlisle, laughing at something a general had said, one hand resting on the shoulder of a man who controlled half the courts in London. "I understand," Clara said quietly. She did not say, "It will not matter." She did not plan for the spilled wine. No one plans for the spilled wine. But as Clara would later understand, standing in the silence of a royal ballroom with 300 pairs of eyes burning into her back, some things do not need to be planned. Some things simply arrive, like a door swinging open at exactly the right moment. And Clara Hewitt had been standing behind that door for 2 years. Edmund Carlisle had not always been the 7th Duke of Ravenswood. For the first 4 years of his life, he had simply been Edmund, a boy with muddy boots and a father who smelled of pipe tobacco and ambition. It was his grandfather, the 6th Duke, who had built the fortune. But it was his father, Harold Carlisle, who had secured it. And the method of that security was the one thing no Carlisle ever spoke of above a whisper. In the winter of 1861, a Southwark solicitor named Thomas Hewitt had made the catastrophic mistake of being both brilliant and honest. He had been retained by the Crown to audit a series of land transfer documents in the southeast counties. Routine work for a man of his caliber. What he found was not routine. Buried inside the Carlisle estate filings were irregularities so deliberate, so precisely constructed, that Thomas Hewitt had immediately drafted a report for the Lord Chancellor's office. He never delivered it. Within a fortnight, forged documents surfaced bearing Thomas Hewitt's own seal, documents that accused him of the very crime he had uncovered in others. The machinery of Harold Carlisle's connections moved with terrifying efficiency. Witnesses were paid, magistrates were persuaded, and Thomas Hewitt, father of one daughter, husband of a woman already weakened by illness, was stripped of his practice, his reputation, and ultimately his freedom. Harold Carlisle attended the man's trial in the front row. He wore his best coat. Edmund had inherited everything: the estates, the title, the fortune. And the secret folded neatly beneath it all like a rotten foundation beneath a marble floor. He was 16 when his father finally told him, not with shame, but with the clinical pragmatism of a man transferring a business asset. "This is how the world works, Edmund. The weak document, the sins of the strong. Our job is to ensure those documents never surface." Edmund had listened. He had learned. And over 30 years, he had become extraordinarily good at ensuring exactly that. Now he stood before the full-length mirror in his private dressing chamber at Ravenswood House, adjusting the gold cufflinks at his wrists with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never once been held accountable for anything. His valet moved silently behind him, smoothing the shoulders of the midnight blue coat. "The carriage is ready, Your Grace." A moment. Edmund studied his reflection. The jaw, the posture, the smile he practiced with the same discipline other men reserved for fencing or scripture. Satisfied, he turned from the mirror and walked toward the door. He did not glance at the freshly pressed shirts hanging in the wardrobe behind him. He did not think about who had ironed them. He never did. Clara Hewitt had applied for the position of lady's maid at Ravenswood House on a gray Tuesday morning in January 1889, carrying a forged letter of reference and a perfectly composed expression that betrayed nothing of what she carried inside her. She got the job within the hour. Mrs. Hartley had remarked that she was unusually observant for a girl of her age. Clara had accepted the compliment with a modest dip of her chin and said nothing. Observant was, in fact, the precise word. From her first morning at Ravenswood, Clara had moved through every room like water through cracks. Silent, thorough, leaving no trace of herself behind. She memorized the layout of the study before the end of her first week. She noted which drawers were locked and which were merely closed. She catalogued the names on correspondence left carelessly on desks. The faces of the men who arrived after dark and left before dawn, and the particular way Edmund Carlyle's jaw tightened whenever the name Hewitt appeared in any context whatsoever. It appeared rarely. He had made certain of that, but rarely was not never. Beneath a loose floorboard in the far corner of her servants' quarters, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of brown twine, was a leather document case so worn at the corners that the stitching had begun to separate. Inside it, ordered with the precision of a woman who had spent years constructing an argument she could not yet make, was everything. 3 signed testimonies from men who had witnessed the original forgery, 2 of them taken from dying men in Southwark charity wards who had nothing left to lose and everything to confess. A copy of the original Carlyle land audit, retrieved at considerable personal cost from a retired clerk who had kept it out of guilt and hidden it out of fear. And most devastatingly, a letter, written in Harold Carlyle's own unmistakable hand, dated 4 days before Thomas Hewitt's arrest, instructing his solicitor to ensure the man never reaches the Lord Chancellor's office. It was, by any measure of English law, sufficient to reopen the case. By any measure, except one. No magistrate in London would accept the accusation of a housemaid against a duke of the realm. No lord would risk Carlyle's wrath on the word of a dead solicitor's daughter. The institutions that should have protected her father had been the very instruments of his destruction, and they had not changed their nature simply because 30 years had passed. Clara needed someone beyond Edmund's reach, someone whose authority had no amount of Carlyle money or connection could quietly redirect. She had been waiting, methodically, patiently, with the particular endurance of a person who has already survived the worst and therefore fears very little else. On the evening of the royal ball, she stood before the small cracked mirror above her washstand, pinned her apron straight, and pressed the document case flat against her ribs beneath her uniform. Then she picked up her serving tray and walked downstairs without a tremor in her hands. The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace was the kind of room that made people forget themselves. Every chandelier held 300 candles. The walls were paneled in cream and gold, the floors polished to a mirror finish that reflected the gowns of countesses and the medals of generals in equal, dazzling measure. The orchestra played from the upper gallery, something light and Viennese that floated above the noise of 400 conversations happening simultaneously beneath it. And at the far end of the room, on a low throne dais draped in crimson and ivory, Queen Adelaide sat with the composed stillness of a woman who had spent 40 years watching powerful people reveal themselves at exactly these kinds of gatherings. Clara moved along the eastern wall with a silver tray of champagne flutes, her eyes tracking the room in the unhurried, comprehensive way she tracked every room. She noted the clustering of cabinet ministers near the south window. She noted the French ambassador's attaché speaking too quietly to a man she recognized from the Carlyle estate records. She noted Edmund holding court near the center of the floor, his laugh arriving half a second before it reached his eyes. She gave him a wide berth. She was almost past him when Lord Fenwick turned. He was a large man, Lord Fenwick, and he turned the way large men in crowded ballrooms always turn, broadly, without looking, with the unconscious entitlement of someone who has never once needed to check whether space was available before occupying it. His elbow caught the edge of Clara's tray with precise, catastrophic accuracy. The glass closest to the edge went first. It seemed, in the stretched silence that followed, to fall rather slowly. The red wine crossed the distance between the tray and Edmund Carlyle's shirt in a dark, widening arc, and settled across his chest and the lapel of his midnight blue coat with the quiet finality of a full stop. The music did not stop, but the conversations nearest to them did. Edmund looked down. Then he looked up, and his eyes found Clara with the speed and coldness of a man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this kind of permission. He did not raise his voice. That was the most frightening thing. He spoke at a perfectly conversational volume, which meant that everyone within 12 feet, and 12 feet in a ballroom that had gone selectively, attentively quiet, heard every syllable with complete clarity. He told her she was incompetent. He told her she was an embarrassment to his household and an affront to the occasion. He told the assembled lords and ladies that this was precisely the consequence of extending charity to girls of no breeding and no background. He smiled once, briefly, at Lord Fenwick as though they were sharing a joke. Then he turned to the nearest footman. "Remove this girl from my sight, and from this palace. She is nothing. She has always been nothing." 300 people heard it. Clara stood completely still, and something in her eyes did not break. It simply, finally, opened. The footman took one step toward her. Clara turned away from him and walked in the opposite direction. It took the room a full 3 seconds to understand what it was seeing. 3 seconds of assuming she had simply misunderstood the instruction, or was moving toward the servants' corridor that ran along the north wall, or was doing any of the reasonable, expected, permissible things a dismissed housemaid might do in the aftermath of a public humiliation. Then the angle of her path became undeniable. She was walking toward the throne dais. The whispers ignited at the edges of the crowd and moved inward like flame along a trail of gunpowder, quick, unstoppable, reaching the center of the room before Clara had covered half the distance. Heads turned. Conversations collapsed mid-sentence. The orchestra continued playing overhead. Oblivious, the Viennese waltz suddenly absurd against the texture of the silence forming below it. Edmund watched her go with an expression of mild, cold amusement. She was going to appeal to the Queen. The thought almost made him smile openly. A maid, appealing to the crown. He reached for a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray and settled in to watch the inevitable interception. Lord Belgrove moved first. He was the Lord Chamberlain's deputy, a man whose entire professional existence was structured around ensuring that exactly this kind of disruption never reached the royal presence. He stepped into Clara's path with his arm extended, his expression carrying the particular blend of authority and condescension that had stopped better people than her. Clara walked past his outstretched hand without altering her pace by a single step. She did not look at him. She did not look at anyone. The Queen's lady-in-waiting was on her feet by the time Clara reached the edge of the carpet that marked the boundary of the throne dais. Lady Gresham was formidable, 50 years old, iron-spined, the personal gatekeeper to the royal presence for over a decade. She moved to place herself directly in Clara's path and drew breath to speak. Queen Adelaide raised one gloved hand. Lady Gresham stopped. The hand was not raised to signal alarm. It was not raised to summon guards or call for removal. It was raised with the quiet, absolute authority of a woman who had spent 40 years distinguishing between disruptions that needed suppressing and moments that needed witnessing. Clara reached the dais. She knelt. With both hands, she placed the worn leather document case on the footstool before the Queen, setting it down with the careful steadiness of someone placing something irreplaceable on an altar. "Your Majesty." Her voice was clear and even. "My name is Clara Hewitt. My father was Thomas Hewitt. And what is in this case belongs to the Crown." The Queen looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached down and opened the case, The orchestra played on. No one heard it. The color left Queen Adelaide's face in stages, slowly, then all at once. And then something else moved in behind it. Something that had nothing to do with shock, and everything to do with the particular coldness of a sovereign who has just understood the precise dimensions of a betrayal committed beneath her throne. Her eyes lifted from the documents. They found Edmund Carlyle across the ballroom, and the champagne glass in his hand became, in that instant, a very precarious thing to be holding. Queen Adelaide set the documents down. She did not set them down quickly, or with agitation, or with any of the visible distress that had briefly crossed her face while reading. She set them down with the slow, deliberate precision of a woman, ensuring that her hands would be completely steady before she used them for anything else. She smoothed the top page once with 2 gloved fingers. Then she folded her hands in her lap and raised her eyes to the room. The orchestra had finally stopped. Clara did not know precisely when it had happened. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th document, the musicians in the upper gallery had become aware, one by one, that no one below them was listening, and had tapered into silence with the quiet instinct of people who understand when a room has changed its nature entirely. 400 people stood without moving. The Queen spoke to Lord Gresham first, her voice carrying in the absolute stillness with no effort whatsoever. She requested that the Royal Council be summoned from the anteroom. She requested that the doors to the ballroom be closed. She requested, in the same measured tone one might use to ask for a cup of tea, that the Duke of Ravenswood remain exactly where he was. Edmund had not moved. He had not moved since the Queen's eyes had found him across the room, and something about the quality of her gaze had nailed his feet to the polished floor with far more authority than any physical restraint could have managed. The champagne glass was still in his hand. He had forgotten it was there. Around him, the lords and generals and ambassadors who had been laughing with him 20 minutes ago had achieved a subtle but unmistakable distance, the instinctive rearrangement of powerful people who can read a room and have no intention of being standing too close to the wrong man when it finishes reading itself. The Royal Council entered through the side door, 3 men in dark coats, who crossed the ballroom floor with the brisk gravity of people who had been told enough to understand the urgency, and nothing else. The Queen handed the first of them the documents without a word. He read the top page. He passed it to the second man. Something moved across all 3 of their faces in sequence, like a shadow crossing the same patch of ground. Clara was still kneeling. "Rise, Miss Hewitt," the Queen said. Clara rose. Queen Adelaide looked at her with an expression that was not warm, precisely, but was something adjacent to it, the look of a woman recalibrating, rapidly and without sentiment, everything she thought she understood about the people she had trusted nearest to her throne. "You will remain within the palace tonight," the Queen said, "under my protection." 2 royal guards stepped forward, not toward Clara, but to either side of her, forming a corridor of safety so unmistakable that a gasp moved through the nearest section of the crowd like a single held breath finally released. Edmund Carlyle set down his champagne glass. His hand, Clara noticed from across the room, was no longer entirely steady. The Royal Council conferred for 4 minutes. Clara counted them. She had spent 2 years counting things: days in service, names in ledgers, lies in official documents, and the habit did not leave her simply because she was now standing inside a circle of royal guards in the most powerful room in England. When the senior council straightened and gave the Queen a single nod, Queen Adelaide turned to face the ballroom with the unhurried composure of a woman who has never once needed a room's permission to speak in it. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. 30 years ago, the Queen began, and the words fell into the silence with the clean precision of stones dropped into still water. A man named Thomas Hewitt presented evidence of criminal fraud within the Carlisle estate filings to the office of the Lord Chancellor. He never arrived. Within a fortnight, he was accused, tried, and imprisoned on the basis of documents bearing his own seal. She paused. The seal on those documents did not belong to Thomas Hewitt. The handwriting on the instruction to intercept him does belong to Harold Carlisle, 6th Duke of Ravenswood, and the family crest pressed into the wax of that instruction belongs to the man standing before us now. Every head in the room turned toward Edmund. His composure fractured in stages, the way ice fractures. First a single line, nearly invisible. Then the spreading network of cracks that precede the collapse. Confusion crossed his face first, the reflexive denial of a man who has controlled every room he has ever entered. Then disbelief, genuine and unguarded, at the sight of documents he had believed destroyed surfacing under royal candlelight 30 years later. And then, the worst of it, the dawning horror of full understanding, the slow, terrible arithmetic of everything he stood to lose, calculated in real time behind his eyes, arriving at its answer all at once. He took one step toward Clara. A royal guard stepped between them without a word. Edmund stopped. The Queen announced the formal inquiry in the same tone she had used for everything else. Measured, absolute, admitting no negotiation. She named the date. She named the presiding council. She confirmed that Clara Hewitt would remain within the palace under royal protection until its conclusion. Then she was finished, and the room remained silent, because no one was entirely certain that it was over. And silence felt, in that moment, like the only appropriate response to what they had witnessed. Clara stood between the two guards and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the particular quality of stillness that is not waiting. She was not waiting anymore. There was nothing left to wait for. Her father's name was in the Queen's mouth. The truth was in the royal council's hands. And the room that had watched her be called nothing was the same room that had just watched her hand a crown its reckoning. She was not triumphant. She was not tearful. She was simply still. Finally, completely still. The orchestra did not play again that evening. The Duke had humiliated his maid before the most powerful room in England. He had handed her nothing but her freedom. And with that freedom, she handed the Queen the one thing his entire bloodline had spent 30 years trying to bury: the truth. Some silences end with a whisper. This one ended with a crown. If this story moved you, held you, or kept you reading until the very last line, then you already know someone else who needs to hear it. Share it with them. And if you believe that truth, no matter how long it is buried, always finds its way into the right hands. Leave a comment below and tell us what Clara's walk across that ballroom meant to you. Like this story, subscribe for more, and we will see you at the next one.